All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone who's joining us today. Just a brief introduction. My name is Sydney Dominguez. I am the president of the Federalist Society chapter at Scalia Law. And joining me today is David Park. He's the president of the Federalist Society chapter at Georgetown undergrad. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Excuse me. If you have a question during this event, please use the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. David will be fielding questions for our panel at the very end. Right now, David and I are going to be introducing our panelists. Just give me 1 second to grab their bios for us. And before I do that, I want to give a brief shout out. Thank you to all of our co-sponsors for this event. Tabitha at Scalia Law with the Christian Legal Society and Ben Janicek with Thomas More Society have been huge helps, as well as Henry at Georgetown's College Republicans chapter. All right, so I'll go ahead and introduce the Scalias, and then David, I'll hand it off to you to introduce Professor Otis and Mr. Whalen.
Sounds good.
All right. So to begin, Father Paul Scalia is the sixth of Justice Scalia's 9 children. He studied theology at the Pontifical Gregorian University and the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. He was ordained a priest for the Diocese of Arlington in 1996 and has served at various parishes in Northern Virginia. Father Scalia is the pastor of St. James Catholic Church in Falls Church and is the Episcopal Vicar for Clergy in the Diocese of Arlington. He has written for various publications and is a frequent speaker on matters of faith and doctrine. Thank you, Father Scalia, for joining us today. All right, and Christopher J. Scalia is the 8th of Justice Scalia's 9 children and a former professor of English. He is currently Director of Academic Programs at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. His book reviews and political commentary have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, and elsewhere. Mr. Scalia lives in Virginia with his wife and 3 children. Thank you, Mr. Scalia, for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right, David?
All right. Well, here's Mr. Edward Whalen. Okay. Mr. Edward Whalen is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He directs EPPC's program on the Constitution, the courts, and the culture. Mr. Whalen, a lawyer and a former law clerk to Justice Scalia, has served in positions of responsibility in all 3 branches of the federal government. In 1981, Mr. Whalen graduated with honors from Harvard College and was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa. He received his Juris Doctorate, magna cum laude, in 1985 from Harvard Law School, where he was a member of the Board of Editors of Harvard Law Review. And moderating this discussion is Professor Lee Otis. Professor Lee Lieberman Otis is a Senior Vice President and Faculty Division Director of the Federal Society. She previously was a Special Assistant and an Associate Deputy Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice, General Counsel of the Department of Energy, and an Associate in the Appellate Section of Jones Day, Revis and Pogue, and an Associate Counsel to President George H.W. Bush, and a law clerk to both Judge and later to Associate Justice Antonin Scalia. Together with David McIntosh, she led the effort to start what became the Chicago chapter of the Society. She also helped organize the Society's first conference at Yale, its second conference at Chicago, and its first Lawyers Division chapter in Washington, D.C., as well as the effort to incorporate the Society, recruit its permanent staff, and obtain its early funding. She was a founding director of the Federal Society. Professor Otis, if you want to take it.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks to both you and Sydney for organizing what I'm sure will be a wonderful discussion on this Constitution Day, which also, and I stole this from Chris Scalia's Twitter feed, although I think I probably could have figured it out myself, turns out to be the 34th anniversary of Justice Scalia's confirmation to the United States Supreme Court. So in many ways, a wonderful, wonderful day. One thing I'll just mention for the law students out there is that, and I held this back from David on purpose so that I could say it myself, I'm also a former student of then Professor Scalia at the University of Chicago Law School, and he also was the first advisor to our Federalist Society chapter out there and played a central role in helping us figure out how to get the first student symposium off the ground. So splendid to be commemorating this under the aegis of your two chapters. Let me get us started off just with a rather basic question, which is what prompted the writing of this book, Ed and Chris?
Well, we actually have 3 books now, as you know, Lee. And first, just let me say how great it is to be speaking to these 2 chapters. Of course, Justice Scalia was an undergrad at Georgetown. I think he really loved his years there. And to have to speak to the chapter at the law school named after him is very special as well. Yeah, we have 3 volumes of his collected works out now. The first one, Scalia Speaks, Reflections on Law, Faith, and Life Well Lived. Hold up here in case you recognize the cover. It's a New York Times bestseller that came out in 2017. Chris and I co-edited that. And that book really came about when I think in the aftermath of Justice Scalia's death, the family was aware that there were a lot of speeches out there and just wondered whether there might be the makings of a book. And frankly, when I was invited to take part in this, I was honored to do so, but I wasn't sure whether there would be much of a book to put together. I'd never worked on a speech for the justice, and I figured he probably gave the same 4 or 6 speeches year in, year out, and we might be able to put together a slender volume of interest to some folks. But instead, when Chris and I received the speeches, a box here, an electronic file there, and started going through them, we discovered this treasure trove of the justices' witty, insightful reflections on all sorts of topics. And it was such a joy for me to read through these speeches, in part because the justice was such a good writer and had such a distinctive voice that I could not read these speeches without hearing his voice, without seeing when he would knowing when he would laugh, seeing his gestures. In a way, he really came alive again for me as I read these speeches. I think it was the same for Chris. In any event, we discovered this treasure trove of speeches, and the challenge then became, what do we exclude, not what do we include? Why don't I hand it off to you there, Chris?
Yeah, with that, thanks, Ed. And by the way, thank you also to everybody attending. It's great to speak to you all, and thank you all for organizing this too. It's wonderful to speak to so many people, even if it is virtually today, and about all these collections and about my father's legacy. Yeah, as Ed mentioned, the real challenge with Scalia Speaks in particular was what to include and what to leave out. There were a lot of great speeches that we didn't include in that first collection because we just didn't think actually they were necessarily appropriate for a general audience, maybe a little bit too in the weeds for general readers, and maybe something we should save for something like The Essential Scalia, available at bookstores everywhere now. And then there were a lot of speeches that going into that collection we thought for sure we would include that ended up being kind of inferior to other versions, or just kind of not up to the same level as a lot of other speeches we didn't know were even out there. And that was one of the great pleasures of editing that collection, was just discovering all these speeches. And as Ed suggested, just getting a real sense of just how often my father spoke, how many different groups of people he spoke to, and consequently, just getting a clear picture of how important he thought that was to his role on the court, just going out and educating people. And I think that's also true in The Essential Scalia, even though it's a more legal volume. It's clear that he's writing to be understood even by non-lawyers, and I think that's been a real kind of reason for his enduring legacy.
And what you see in Scalia Speaks, I think, is really Antonin Scalia, the man in full, the man of faith, family, and friendships. It really, rounded, comprehensive picture of who he was. You'll find in this volume brilliant explorations of the Constitution, originalism, and the role of judges. But you also find deep reflections on citizenship, religion, and education, inspiring talks on life, faith, and courage, and stirring portraits of American heroes like Washington and Lincoln. There also is a whole section of eulogies. I remember when Chris and I first ran across some of these, we thought, gosh, these are so beautiful, but no one is going to know who this person is. So how can we, include these? But as we've run across more and more, we realized we put together, I think we ended up with 6 or 8 of them. You really get a picture of what mattered to the justice, what he valued in his friends. And a number of people have told me that the eulogies were the most stirring part of the book. There's one law professor who told me that he found himself crying, over the death of someone he had never met, because Justice Scalia's account was so touching. The book has, of course, lots of wit, lots of great laughs, but it really, I think, is Justice Scalia's reflections on what it means to be an American and what we need to do to sustain this great American experiment in Republican self-government. An experiment that he knew was inherently fragile, and that we needed to regenerate the capital to keep it going from decade to decade. This book, again, was a great joy to work on, and Chris wrote a wonderful introduction to it, and maybe, Lee, we could turn to the second book, and then the current one, if I may.
Absolutely. So I think Father Scalia, I think you wrote the introduction to the second book, if I'm remembering correctly. Anything that you wanted to say about that one?
Absolutely. And first, thank you for the invitation to be with you all. Well, and first, I wanted to say about the collection, the first collection, Scalia Speaks. Ed made the point that we thought that he just had like the same 4 or 5 speeches, right? And he was the after dinner speaker at some event here in Northern Virginia years ago, and one of the people at table said to him during dinner, said, "Which speech are you giving tonight?" And that terrified him. He said, well, and it was the 2 Thomases, right? The Christian as Cretan. And the response was, "Oh, I love that one." And so, I think we had good reason to think that it was only the 4 or 5 that were out there, but of course, there ended up being many more.
Hey, Paul.
Yes.
Paul, can I jump in there real quick? Just before we leave Scalia Speaks, I just want to say, just to underscore how surprised we were by some of the content in there. One of my favorite speeches in that collection is one I didn't even know he delivered, and I don't think many people knew he delivered. He was invited to speak at the 100th anniversary of Juilliard, the School of the Arts in Manhattan. And, it's not really a place where you expect him to speak, where, any conservative Supreme Court justice to speak, but the president of the school invited him to talk about law and the arts. And he was on a panel with Stephen Sondheim, and I'm blanking on the name of an opera singer who was on the panel with him. And so it was a wonderful speech, a very, very funny and disarming, kind of self-deprecating speech that turned into very important meditation kind of on the role of the art of the law in helping the arts flourish. But again, we just had no idea he even delivered that speech.
As Renee Fleming, as well as the historian David McCullough.
Oh, that's right. McCullough was on that too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And actually, touching on that, what Scalia Speaks brings out is how broad his interests were, and how much that I think contributed to his legal writing. That he had interest in all of these different things about history and the arts and hunting and fishing, and those are all in there. So yeah, the second book on faith is there you go on faith. Well, for as long as he was a public figure, I always heard him described as a devout Catholic, and that always kind of puzzled me, because maybe it's just me, but the word devout always just conjured, images of, little old ladies with rosary beads and pious faces and everything like that. And that just wasn't who he was. He had great devotion and great conviction about his faith, but it was a distinctly, kind of Scalia tone to it. It was a little bit belligerent at times and in your face, but also at other times very devout and very in that traditional sense of the word, and very humble. And so I was very, obviously for me, I think for all of us to a certain degree, but well, I'm the priest, if you couldn't tell. So we, his faith really made an impression on me throughout my life, and so I was thrilled to see that collection, not only of his writings on faith, but how he impacted others. And he wasn't he didn't really evangelize people. He didn't he didn't get into that, but he not deliberately anyway, but he certainly had an impact, as Ed, I think he had on you when you clerked for him, and I think for all of us in the family. So I think it's a great collection that really brings it out very well.
Yeah, and the collection includes kind of brief personal meditations from a number of people whose own religious lives and beliefs were affected by Dad's, including a former clerk who was really kind of moved by, at least one former clerk who was moved by Dad's, I guess, piety or devotion or whatever word you want to use to describe that. And just as Paul said, he people always ask kind of how he had that influence on us, and it was because I think he and our mom both kind of picked their moments of when to pull us aside and instruct us. They weren't always lecturing us about what we just heard in mass or things like that. And most importantly, they lived it. It was clear to us by how they behaved and how they ordered our family that religion was a big deal and it should matter.
And that well, it was hard to get around it because there were 9 of us, and so that sort of already we were kind of the Catholic family out there. But also it was I think both Mom and Dad conveyed that it's very much the intellect is very important in terms of in the faith, that it's not just sentimentality. In fact, nothing drove them crazier than just pure sentimentality, in the liturgy or in homilies. And so there was it. Dad definitely brought that dimension, that it's the intellectual rigor and consistency in the faith.
So obviously we're also celebrating today the publication of a new book. So Ed, do you want to say anything about the new book?
Sure. We have just published The Essential Scalia, thank you, Chris, on the Constitution, the courts, and the rule of law. This is a book that, as its subtitle indicates, is really focused on Justice Scalia's legal work. It was co-edited by Sixth Circuit Judge Jeffrey Sutton, who also clerked for Justice Scalia, actually the same year I did, and it was great to work with Jeff on this project. It includes a beautiful foreword by Justice Elena Kagan, and I should have mentioned with regard to Scalia Speaks that it likewise has a beautiful foreword from Justice Ginsburg, and On Faith has one from Justice Thomas. But I think particularly the forewords from the unexpected justices, those across the ideological aisle, really speak to the justices' real interest in people and engaging people and arguing with people, but in forming friendships even with people with whom he had some pretty fundamental disagreements. And as you can see, Justice Kagan and Justice Ginsburg, really reciprocated that friendship. Justice Kagan's foreword begins, In the 6 years Nino and I served together on the Supreme Court, I held to an unwavering rule. When Nino circulated a new opinion, I would put aside whatever else I was doing to read it. Whether I expected to agree or to disagree, I wanted to know immediately what Nino had to say. And I think for many of us, when the Supreme Court would issue an opinion or a set of opinions, I would always look to see, did Justice Scalia write an opinion in any of these, and go to it first, because it was always a lot of fun to read what he had to say. Also, I think most people would discover that they really could not be confident they fully understood an opinion, a ruling in a case, until they read what he had to say. Whether or not they agreed with it, they wanted to know what he had to say. And I think of this book as basically a volume on your bookshelf that can present you the same wonder of discovery and surprise when you look to see, gosh, I'm thinking about the Fourth Amendment or separation of powers. What did Justice Scalia have to say on that? And you'll be reading through an opinion, and suddenly there'll be a laugh out loud line or this amazing analysis. And over the course of his long career, including before being a judge, first on the DC Circuit, then of course on the Supreme Court, over the course of that career, he addressed virtually every significant legal issue and had interesting and important things to say on it. And this volume collects all those, I think, in a way that's going to be very accessible, not just to lawyers and law students, but also to non-lawyers who are interested in learning about the law and learning what a giant in the law had to say. On this Constitution Day, I think especially of the justices' great contributions to what we call the structural Constitution, to understanding of separation of powers and federalism. He explained, in numerous venues, that there are lots of countries that have constitutions that on paper are better than ours, that guarantee all sorts of things, or at least purport to. But they weren't worth the paper they were written on, because they were not accompanied by a government structure that operated to ensure those liberties. And of course, in under our Constitution, we have the horizontal separation of powers among the three branches of the federal government. And we have the vertical separation of powers, or federalism, that disperses power between the national government and the 50 states. And in reading what he has to say about these basic structural principles, I think you'll learn so much about the genius of the Constitution and how it is that we have been able to live under this document for so long. Again, you can go from topic to topic and find all sorts of things that are interesting and informative and just plain fun to read.
So one thing that stood out for me when I read Scalia Speaks was exactly how determined the justice was about his ironclad rule of speaking, which was that you never tell people what they want to hear. I thought that was actually one of the great things about him as a speaker, was that, I was always going to be surprised by whatever it was he had to say. Do you have a favorite example of that in Scalia Speaks?
I would go back to the speech I was describing before, the Juilliard speech. He ended that speech by telling him, by laying out the limits he thought he recognized in what's kind of guaranteed by freedom of speech, and he said that it was probably more limited than most people in that room would want to believe. And then he ended with the criticism of the NEA. And suggesting that if you don't want government deciding what art is, you shouldn't be asking the government to fund art, which I don't imagine went over terribly well. I don't think they booed him. I think the reason that it was such a masterful speech is that he started off, as I said, very self-deprecating and kind of joking about the fact that he was even there. And so by the end, he could kind of breathe a little bit of fire after having won them over. But yeah, towards the end, he definitely did not tell them what they wanted to hear. And it was really, I know that I've spoken to, I spoke to the president of Juilliard, who obviously invited Dad and was there at the speech. He said it went over very well. But you know, he was willing to challenge people. He did that at graduation speeches too. You know, his speeches weren't, you know, he didn't read, "Oh, the places you'll go." You know, he challenged us. He delivered the. I think he spoke at Father Paul's high school graduation and my high school graduation. He gave different speeches, but at my high school graduation, he said, basically, you're going off to college. You're not going to have anybody supervising you in the same way that they did before. So be careful, make good decisions, surround yourself with smart people. It was kind of, I wouldn't say it was intimidating, but it was making clear the challenge that was before us.
Well, I think,
I was going to say, first of all, I'm delighted to know that was a principle, because I've told Chris and probably Ed this story that one day, and I think it was a Sunday, I think we were on our way to church, and I think I was still in college, and he, apropos of nothing, he just turned to me and said, "Never tell people what they want to hear." And I've thought about that a lot, and I don't know that it works the same way in my line of work, but I'm glad to know I wasn't the only recipient of that advice. The speech in Scalia Speaks that stands out in my mind is the one to the pro-life group, right, where he says, "I'm not a pro-life justice," and I think that was partly just the fun of tweaking them, right? But I think there was also a very, very important, and more importantly, a point of jurisprudence that he was making in that.
Yeah, that was a speech I was going to mention as well. I think it's under the heading "Faith in Judging," and he actually hated it when people would identify him as pro-life. He would say, "Look, my opposition to Roe is based on the fact that the Constitution does not speak one way or the other on the topic of abortion." And of course, he was not a pro-life justice in the sense that he never took the position that the Constitution forbids permissive abortion laws. His position was that the Constitution was silent on this, and it was up to the people in the different states to adopt different policies one way or the other on this. But to the same Catholic group, I think it was actually a newspaper in Long Island, but again, they were celebrating him for what they thought to be his contributions to the pro-life cause. He emphasized that the only dictate of his religion that he believed affected his judging was the proposition that thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not lie about what the text of a law means. Thou shalt not lie about the facts of a case. But the rest was dictated by the traditional craft of judging. And that, religious folks should not expect judges to indulge their religious convictions in the same way that they would not want other judges to indulge their policy preferences or ethical convictions on a whole range of matters. So this was definitely a strong jurisprudential principle on his part, and one that he welcomed the opportunity to emphasize.
If I can, under the heading of don't tell people what they want to hear, I never had this conversation with him. I broached it one time, but yeah, he's not importing any Catholic doctrine or teaching into his jurisprudence. That's absolutely right, of course. But there are certain habits of thought that are, while not unique to the Catholic Church, are certainly necessary for it. And the most obvious one, to my mind, is that I think his interpretation of the Constitution followed the same lines of the Church's interpretation of Scripture. And it's an interpretation of Scripture that is, I think, found most in the Catholic Church. It's certainly very different from a fundamentalist or a liberal Protestant interpretation of Scripture, and taking the text seriously and then examining the tradition. That's very much a habit of thought. that is distinctly Catholic, but not exclusively. I think another way is his insistence that he's not concerned with results, with the outcome. He wants to do the law right, and whether it's the flag burning decision or whatever else. He just wants to do the law right, and well, that's, I think, again, a habit of thought, which is necessarily but not exclusively Catholic. Is morality is a matter of making the proper choices, deciding rightly, and not being concerned with what what the outcome is externally. And so I think that his faith meant so much to him that it couldn't help but shape his way of approaching and thinking about things.
Father, do you want to say a word, as long as we're talking about telling people what they don't want to hear or not what they want to hear? One of his last speeches to the Dominicans. You want to talk about that?
I think he was wrong. I think he was wrong in that speech.
But it's still.
I think it was his positivism going too far, but yeah, I mean, this is a great example of not telling people what they want to hear. Is he went to the Dominican House of Studies, right? It was January 2016, and it was the anniversary. I don't know what anniversary.
The
800th anniversary of the founding of the Dominicans. And although St. Dominic is their founder, St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, is their greatest patron. And he took that occasion to go through Thomistic writings and point out why St. Thomas Aquinas was dead wrong about the interpretation of law and the role of judges.
He compared him to Earl Warren.
To Earl Warren.
But Paul, sorry, Father, I forget the context here, but I think he was right. I mean, the basic argument he's making is that St. Thomas Aquinas's understanding of what judges should do is at odds with the role of an American judge, a judge in the constitutional system.
I don't think that he made that part clear.
He did, and I'll say, because I actually asked him at that event what I thought was a helpful question, and say, perhaps what you're talking about, your difference is rooted in the fact that we are in a system of separation of powers, and a system that's different from that. Aquinas's approach may well be right, but he rejected that.
Right. I mean, I think that's the crucial distinction, is that he is talking about the role of a judge according to the American Constitution, and comparing it to, so
I think maybe
high medieval Europe and Christendom.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just to it would be helpful maybe to clarify what you guys are disagreeing with him about. What was he saying, and why do you think he was wrong, Father Scalia?
Well, I mean, Saint Thomas Aquinas has I mean, he's writing, it's the High Middle Ages of Christendom. Everybody is on the same page theologically, and it's one system of belief. And his view of the judge is that the judge is bringing in natural law and deciding cases on that basis, and if not according to divine law and revelation. And of course, in St. Thomas's context, that makes sense. And there wasn't, as Ed pointed out, there wasn't the separation of powers that we have. And so I think that he was, taking that out of context, and the entirety of the legal system in that time was very consciously rooted in natural law, and nowhere near as positivistic as I think my dad was.
Yeah, and Scalia speaks. This is a speech under the heading "Natural Law," and again, as Father Scalia just indicated, it really explores the relationship between natural law and positive law,
which is a live issue today, and there are still people who are arguing about whether the justice, is right about this. So this is not just a dispute about about Dominicans and St. Thomas.
That's absolutely right.
You could understand the entire Living Constitutionalist project as a distorted view of what natural law is, sort of the imposition of unnatural law in substitution for positive law. So, absolutely, the issues all around us, and not just in terms of the intramural debates on the right now in some Catholic circles.
Um, Changing gears for a minute here. What do you have a favorite Scalia story? I'm sure there are many to pick from, and I have one that I can tell if you want me to get us started.
Do you want inspiring, edifying, or amusing?
I know it's a challenge, right? I mean, there are lots of options. I think think about our audience here and think about which ones they will find most interesting. The one I'm going to tell is that I clerked for him, as I think people, as David said, both on the Court of Appeals and on the Supreme Court. And when I was clerking for him, Justice Brennan was still on the Supreme Court. And he and Justice Brennan, again, had a wonderful relationship. But he was invited to Justice Brennan's 80th birthday party. And this was a justices only event, so the clerks weren't invited. But he went there, and arrayed all around Justice Brennan's chambers, he reported back, were many volumes of opinions that Justice Brennan had contributed to. And so he walked into the room, looked around it, and said, "So many cases, so few years to overrule them." Indeed, that proved to be a challenge. But the justice reported that Justice Brennan thought that was extremely funny. Ed, do you have one you want to share?
Well, I'll mention not so much a story as perhaps the influence of his personal characteristics on his jurisprudence. Perhaps a rare example where he deviated. The new volume contains a dissent that he wrote, joined actually by Justices Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan, in a case called Navarrete. Now, this involved a driver who was stopped because his vehicle matched the description of a vehicle that had been the subject of an anonymous tip. And I'm told by one of the clerks working on this that perhaps the justice's own driving habits made him particularly sensitive to the driving rights of those who might be the subject of anonymous calls. But perhaps his sons can speak more to that.
Yeah, he was not a textualist when it came to traffic laws. But it's funny, Ed, I hadn't read that case before until I read I recorded the audio book for this collection. And I just made the same assumption. I said, yeah, I understand why he came out here.
Well, okay. I mean, in that regard, when Justice Souter was newly appointed and confirmed, and my parents had him over for dinner, and he followed my dad home from the court. So my dad drove, and Souter's, and so you've got this, New England guy, right, who lives in the countryside of New England, following a Queens native, and so he comes for dinner. We have a nice dinner, and then he's getting ready to leave, and he says, "Well, how do I get out of the neighborhood?" And my dad said, "Well, I'll drive you out. You just follow me out." And I stepped in and said, I'll lead him out, Dad. And I walked Justice Souter out to his car, and he said, "Thank you. I didn't want to say it, but your father drives like a bat out of hell." And so, but a more edifying story. And Ed, I think this was the term you were there. I mean, I was very young. It was, I had just graduated from college. It was the Casey decision. And I went to the court for the handing down of that decision, which of course was a disaster, and one of his most, I think, powerful dissents and prophetic. And it was the end of the term, and there was supposed to be, like a celebration in the chambers for the end of the term. And I went back to the chambers, and my dad and Justice Thomas were gathered there with their clerks, and everybody had a glass of champagne to celebrate the end of the term, but nobody was celebrating, and everybody just kind of looking into the glasses. And I was just so inspired with the way he really tried to encourage everyone and to point to the good things that had been done that term. And even in the dissents, he said, that they'll be read in law schools for years to come. And really, I mean, it clearly weighed very heavily on him. And we know now even more, how much went into to that decision. But he did not let that get in his way, but was really attentive to his clerks and and encouraging them.
Anything that you really wish you could have included in one of these books and that you ended up not including? What's your favorite thing that ended up on the cutting room floor?
I'm pretty happy with the choices we made. Now, there was one speech he gave that, had I been aware of it at the time of Scalia Speaks, I would have given serious consideration to including it, but I didn't discover it till later. It is, however, in the Essential Scalia. This is a speech that he gave on the topic of racial preferences when he was a law professor. It's a rather provocative speech in some respects. It's titled "The Disease as Cure," again suggesting that the more you discriminate on the basis of race, the deeper you're going to make the problem. But he also, in this speech, proposes a restorative justice handicapping system. It's a Swiftian modest proposal about the points that should be assigned to individuals based on their ancestry. I think it's a powerful speech. Again, I'm not sure it would have made it into Scalia Speaks, as it might be a little harder edged than some of the speeches we have there. I will say that the justice, and you can see this in the speeches in Scalia Speaks, especially the early speeches on the American character and ethnicity. He loved America's ethnicities in a way that the multiculturalists of today don't. He loved the differences. He celebrated the differences. Yes, he found humor in the differences, including, as you'll see in the speech he gave on St. Patrick's Day on the Italian view of the Irish, one that always draws a lot of laughs. But he did not think that an appreciation for each other's differences meant we had to deny the differences. What he thought was so special about the American creed is it unified us with our differences. And I just, again, I think he provides an important lesson, one that lots of people aren't going to want to listen to, about about ethnicities in American society being bonded together by friendship, by an appreciation of differences, by a certain sense of humor, and by the American creed.
Just building on Ed's point about some of the material we didn't include in Scalia Speaks, after that book was, well, actually while we were still working on that book, shortly before it was published, I talked to a couple of lawyers who mentioned things that they would say things like, "Oh, so you're definitely including," and they would name a speech. It was usually a speech about administrative law, and I would have to explain, we're hoping to sell this to a general audience. I'm not sure many people who aren't lawyers are going to care about that. So I'm happy to report that those administrative law cases are in the Essential Scalia. They made the cut this time around. And they're very good.
Not all of them made it though.
Yeah.
Law professor John McGinnis, who's a brilliant mind, had a wonderful review today of the Essential Scalia. His one regret is that we should have had more administrative law cases in it.
Yeah, all of them from his dad's days editing Regulation magazine.
Yeah.
What do you think that law students today, might learn from Justice Scalia, not in terms of the law, but in terms of how he went about being a justice, and how and basically what is it that students today should emulate, do you think?
Oh, there's so much. Let me mention a couple things. One is the justice loved argument, but not for argument's sake, not for winning cheap debaters' points. I mean, many people think that it's clever argument to distort the other side's position and to win applause from yahoos for doing so. No, he knew, he understood argument as designed to get to, or at least towards, the truth. And he thought that people who argued together in good faith, respecting each other, could narrow their differences, could perhaps better understand each other, change their positions. I think he was always open to doing that. And I think even when he circulated his dissents in these cases, he was still hopeful that even now someone will see the light and change positions. I think one of the things that he particularly liked about Justice Ginsburg and Justice Kagan is that they, unlike some of his other colleagues, would engage him, wouldn't simply ignore his dissent because they had the votes for majority. They would try to answer it. I think he respected that. But related to this is his wonderful writing. And again, you cannot read his opinions or his speeches, for that matter, without appreciating how brilliant he is in writing prose, using, for example, figures of speech that aren't there for show. They actually clarify, they distill, they make you understand what's really going on. Perhaps my favorite example of that is in the Morrison versus Olson, his solo dissent in 1988, just at the end of his second term on the court, on the question whether the independent counsel statute was constitutionally permissible or not. This statute had a provision that restricted the Attorney General's authority to remove the independent counsel, saying he could do so only for cause. And Chief Justice Rehnquist, in his majority opinion, actually cited that provision and saying, look at all the authority this confers. He can remove him for cause. To which Justice Scalia responded, this is like referring to shackles as a means of locomotion. And I know the first time I read that, 30 years ago, everything clicked for me. This image that explains that no, the baseline for presidential authority is to be able to remove at will. It's not to be shackled. And when that ability is impaired, you can't say this guy can still move around. No, that explained very vividly why he thought this was unconstitutional. But he also had, I think one reason he was such a good speechwriter is he had this odd ability to write in a way that things sounded really good when they were read out loud. And in fact, he actually would often read his opinions out loud. He really cared how they sounded. And he would sometimes call up Justice Thomas and say, Clarence, you got to hear this, or call us in for a reading. I think this may relate to his theatrical background, both in high school and in college. He was the president, I believe, of the Georgetown Theatrical Society. I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but I assume it still exists. And he just had this great appreciation for how words sounded when read. And of course, there's all the wonderful alliteration in some of his opinions. I did a post today where I excerpted some of his amazing dissent in the PGA v. Martin case involving the question of whether the Americans with Disabilities Act required that a golfer who had difficulty walking would have to be permitted to use a cart during tournaments. And in that, I'll just quote one sentence. I'm sure the framers of the Constitution, aware of the 1457 edict of King James II of Scotland prohibiting golf because it interfered with the practice of archery, fully expected that sooner or later the paths of golf and government, the law and the links, would once again cross, and the judges of this august court would someday have to wrestle with that age-old jurisprudential question for which their years of studying the law have so well prepared them: is someone riding around a golf course from shot to shot really a golfer? So many wonderful lines in that opinion. But again, you just see the alliteration with the golf and government, law and the links, this appreciation for how language sounds. But just one last point here is writing wasn't easy. He worked so hard at it. He liked to say, I think it was a Dorothy Parker line, he did not enjoy writing, he enjoyed having written. But I just remember seeing him sitting at his keyboard, and it's almost as though the muscles in his head were churning. And then that'd be that aha moment when he got the prose just how he wanted to. So, for all of us who are nearly as good writers as he was, it's a lesson. Practice, practice, practice. Work hard at it.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that point about his work on his writing, one of the speeches we have in Scalia Speaks is about exactly that topic, and how much effort he put into his writing. And I asked him once whether writing came easy to him, and he said, "No, it's hard as hell." And that was such a relief for me, really, because he really made it seem too easy sometimes. And of course, I should have known that would have been his answer, because I had seen him working on his writing. Coming home, coming home late at night and seeing him working in his study, or just after dinner noticing that he would go right into his study and continue working. And actually that brings me to another point that I think probably Ed could confirm too, is that my dad, I think, really emphasized to his clerks that they should make time for family and when possible. And Dad himself was home for dinner every night. And that wasn't always great, I should say, because sometimes he got home, we would wait for him, and he would come home at like 7:30, and we'd be eating right into 8 o'clock, and prime time is missing my favorite shows. But in retrospect, I really appreciate how how much that meant, and what obviously he was making a point of doing that to be with his family every night, and leading us by starting grace, every meal with grace, usually in record time.
Right, like his driving.
Yes, exactly.
He prayed the way he drove. Yeah, and along those same lines, I just think that the law was one of the most important things in his life, but it was not the most important thing. And I think that's what the variety of interests I mentioned before. It brought so much to I think to his writings and his way of analyzing things, because it wasn't only that. There was, and I think that's what enabled him to connect with other people as well, not just the common desire to arrive at the truth of things, but also he had a variety of interests, and that enabled him to connect with a lot of people.
Which sort of takes us back to the Juilliard speech, because I think that he would say that should be law's aspiration in a certain sense, to be important, but not the most important thing, to enable the most important things. by providing the kind of certainty around which people can build institutions and build their lives. Okay. Also, by the way, in the Juilliard speech, he said that the First Amendment did not extend to music, which was, I think, a particularly wonderful thing in terms of being contrarian to be telling the premier school of music in the country.
Well, yeah, he said it might protect the libretto of an opera, but not necessarily the music of an opera, which is, I think, a fun distinction.
Okay, so I think at this point we should bring in the rest of our audience here, and so I think if we are ready to do that, I think David is going to call on people for questions, and you have a Q&A function. David can remind people perhaps who are not aware of that and how that should work, but I think we have a bunch teed up already. So David?
Yep, and make sure throughout, like if you have any questions, use the Q&A function on the bottom right here, and then you can just ask questions and I'll just go through them. So the first one is by Cody Ray Milner. What is the most important life, not legal, in parentheses, okay, advice that Justice Scalia ever gave you? This is a thinker, huh?
Well, I'll jump in. I guess I wrote about this in a piece after his death, but I remember, again, I clerked for him during the term of Planned Parenthood versus Casey and Lee versus Weissman. It was a very tough term in lots of respects, and you know, it was just very frustrating to me to see how many of his colleagues would not engage his arguments, would not engage in, you know, what I thought was reasoned decision making. I remember at some point, I don't remember what the occasion was. I just went and said, like, how can you put up with these folks? And I think his response was, you know, I have Maureen. That is that, you know, his wife was his rock. And, you know, it emphasized for me what I knew already, but which is something that's very easy for people to overlook, which is, you know, the most important decision you make in your life is not going to be what college or law school you go to or what job you take. It's going to be properly pursuing your vocation. Perhaps it's your vocation for small, you know, relatively small number of people for religious life. For many other people, it's a vocation to be a husband or wife. And you not only do you need to find the person who's going to be just right for you, but you need to make yourself into the person who's going to be just right for the person you want to marry. And yeah, so I'd say that was a memorable lesson for me.
Yeah, I would say for me, just growing up and seeing Dad holding himself accountable to his faith and to his God, and you know, seeing him kneeling in church or you know, even line for confession. I knew that he was, you know, a strong man. And as the years went by and he was appointed to the, you know, appellate court and then the Supreme Court, I came to appreciate that, gosh, he's actually really smart, isn't he? And but all that while, you know, he still, you know, his practice of the faith was, you know, holding himself accountable to the one who is, of course, who is wisdom itself. And so it just, you know, in order to really be wise, you have to, of course, worship, you know, incarnate wisdom itself. So that for me was just, you know, knowing his natural talents, his accomplishments because of his work, and his great, you know, authority in the legal world. But still, he humbled himself in terms of the faith, and I think that was what enabled him to be wise in other ways.
Yeah, and in my case, I would just point to, I guess, an instance that wasn't really general life advice, but very specific advice for a particular situation, and that was in 2015. I was a college professor, not terribly pleased with my job and struggling to get a better one in academia. And I had talked to my mom about maybe leaving academia and moving back up to Northern Virginia, where I'd grown up and where most of my family, including obviously my parents, were. And I didn't mention this to Dad because I was worried that he wouldn't want me to do that. His father had been a professor of Romance languages, and of course my father had been a law professor for some time, and I knew that my dad was pretty proud when I became a professor. And when I got tenure, he sent me a very nice congratulations note. So I didn't want to disappoint him, but he wrote me a letter. He typed letters. It was pretty cool getting a letter from him. He did emails too, but for really big things, he did letters. And in the letter, he said basically, move back up here. You'll be able to find a job. We want to have you back up here, and you can have a better life for your family up here. You can you can give more to your wife and children if you move up here. And kind of when that concern, that letter kind of clinched it for me. I mean, I was confident that I could make that decision, and my wife's pretty insistent. I wouldn't call it nagging, but encouragement. Let's call it encouragement. Also played a role in that too, I'll say. So we moved up, and I'm very, very grateful that I took that letter to heart, because we moved up here in September, very late August 2015, and he died about a half year later. And I got to spend a lot more time with him because I made that move. So, he gave me other advice, but that very specific letter and note of encouragement made a huge difference in my life. And if I can ramble on a little bit more by sharing a bit from Judge Sutton's introduction. He tells a great story that I think also includes great advice. So this is what Judge Sutton writes. During one of my last visits with Justice Scalia, I saw striking evidence of the Scalia-Ginsburg relationship. As I got up to leave his chambers, he pointed to 24 roses on his table and noted that he needed to take them down to Ruth for her birthday. Wow, I said. I doubt I have given a total of 24 roses to my wife in almost 30 years of marriage. You ought to try it sometime, he retorted. Unwilling to give him the last word, I pushed back. So what good have all these roses done for you? Name one 5-4 case of any significance where you got Justice Ginsburg's vote. Some things, he answered, are more important than votes. I let him have the last word.
Professor Otis, you want to add on?
Well, so I'll add on in two ways. This is just, again, for our law students. I was at a speech where he was speaking to law professors, and I think a version of this made its way into the speech that he gave to the Scalia Law School at George Mason when it was, I forget what the occasion was, but it's in Scalia Speaks. It might be opening the new building, actually, the then new building.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. And so, this was a piece of advice that he was giving to the faculty at the law school, and he said, look, all of the professional pressures go in one direction on this, and when I was a law professor, I also found myself very focused on the importance of producing a new piece of scholarship. But in fact, the most important thing that I did as a law professor was most likely my teaching. And so, I would encourage all law professors to remember that the shelf life of a law review article is, maybe 10 years if it's a really good one. Whereas, as a law professor, you're going to have the opportunity to shape how law students think about the law, for a lifetime. And so, that is really the most important part of your job, and focus on that, even though that's not necessarily what's going to bring you fame and glory in the near term. The other thing is, I will say that not all of his advice was always excellent. For example, I think I remember his telling his son Gene that if he was, going to go to a law firm, he should find one, where he could really work 9 to 5, and he could find such a thing in Cleveland at Jones Day, which, turned out to be a somewhat optimistic scenario about what life at a national Midwestern law firm might be like. But nonetheless, I think I think he did a remarkable job of giving good advice when it really mattered.
Mhm. So this next one's from Matt Ainsley. What do you think made the justice so fond of teaching the public, students, lawyers, and general public about the role of the courts and the Constitution, American exceptionalism, and etc.? He seems to stand apart from his fellow justices on this point, and I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you for being here.
Well, can I just say that he likes to teach about a lot of things. It wasn't just this. When shortly after his death, our brother Gene, somebody was putting together bound volumes of all Dad's opinions, and our brother Gene asked if we wanted a set, and he said it's all of his opinions bound together, and then he quickly clarified, just his legal decisions, his legal opinions, because he had opinions on a lot of things. And but no, it's no, seriously, he was a natural teacher, and at the dinner table growing up, I mean, it was grammar, it was history, it was art history, it was philosophy, and so I just think in that regard he couldn't not teach, and because law was his field, he was going to do that most of all.
Yeah, I just adding on, I think there was also maybe a sense of urgency there too. I mean, he recognized that there was a real threat or danger to people misunderstanding what sort of government our Constitution organized, what the structure is supposed to be like, what the relationship between the branches is supposed to be. It mortified him that law students didn't read all of the Federalist Papers. He was out there to really kind of evangelize to a degree, because he recognized just, I guess, how much the courts had changed in his own lifetime, and it was a very long uphill battle to get them back to sort of specifically the federal judges having the proper role that they were supposed to have. And so he worked hard and made that case as often as he really had the opportunity.
David, let me just mention something that I should have mentioned earlier, a little off topic here, but I'm happy to provide a book plate for the Essential Scalia for anyone who would like one, signed by both Judge Sutton and me. I understand that David and Sydney will be able to distribute this information. You can also look at my bench memos posts; will be there. But basically, just send an email to essentialscalia at eppc.org, and we'll take care of it. Okay.
We can
Thank you.
definitely
I'll
do
ask
that.
that in like 3 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much for extending that opportunity to us.
That's happy to.
Yeah, one thing relating to this, I think, is also that I think he did have a theory about the importance of the people to sustaining the republic, and that the Constitution, is ultimately the people's document, and that it's up to us to keep the republic, if you will, that, as Ben Franklin said, a republic if you can keep it. But I think he was, partly just viewing as part of his job to educate people about that, because it's essential to the preservation of the constitutional system for people to know what the system is.
All right, so this next question is by Cody Ray Milner. Cody Milner, he's a 3L at Scalia Law School, and he says, "Thank you all so much for coming and speaking to us tonight. It is a true pleasure to hear your memories of Justice Scalia. One of the justices' memorable quotes was, 'I attack ideas, I don't attack people.' And his close friendship with Justice Ginsburg is very famous. Can you share how you saw this in his life while you were children for Christopher and Father Paul, and while he was your mentor to Mr. Whalen and Professor Otis?"
Father Paul, you want to start that one?
No, you go ahead.
So I mean, I'll approach that by just addressing his friendship with Justice Ginsburg directly. They were friends before either of them were judges. At least they knew each other, and then they became better friends when they were judges together on the DC circuit. And there's a great speech in Scalia Speaks. He roasts Justice Ginsburg for, I think that it's her 10th anniversary on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. She's not on the Supreme Court yet. He is, and it's a lovely tribute to her after he makes fun of her for a little while, because they're not colleagues anymore. He has no reason to believe they ever will be again. So it's kind of a wistful reminiscence of their time as colleagues together, and it touches on some of the points Ed was making about just how he loved working with her and engaging in ideas with her. But it was, they gathered together pretty often. They had an annual, the Ginsburgs, Justice Ginsburg and her husband, threw a New Year's party every year. And my parents went to that every year. And it was just kind of, I guess it didn't really, growing up, it didn't strike me as odd because they had just been friends for so long. And I should add that Justice Ginsburg's husband, Marty, was also very close to my mom. They had a wonderful friendship too. And I think that they were just kind of able to focus on and pay attention to all the many, many things they had in common. Not the differences they had. So they shared a love of opera. They shared a love of wine. The spouses were friends. And Marty Ginsburg really liked to cook, and my father really liked to eat. So there was that. And I think also that, just kind of the more basic element of, you had these two New Yorkers growing up different boroughs, but around the same time. I think they were kind of they must have already been a little bit familiar to each other. So I think that helped. But I do think I think people love hearing about that friendship and his friendship with Justice Kagan too, because it does seem like a rarity nowadays, at least in public friendships. But I think in everyday friendships, I think a lot of us have friendships like that, where we have very close friends, maybe people we've known for a very long time that we don't agree about much, except for maybe the music we share, or the sports teams we root for, or even the high school we went to. So I think people can relate to their friendship and like hearing about it for that reason too.
Yeah, actually, that last point, I worry that because of social media, we're just more and more sort of isolated, just in our own little echo chambers. So, but 1 year at least, I got home from New Year's Eve. I was in high school. I got back from New Year's Eve parties before mom and dad, and they were at the Ginsburgs, and I think they're like up till 4 a.m. arguing about, I don't know, the Second Amendment or something like that. And so, yeah, they were very close friends. And, but, you know, all of the other justices too. I mean, it really was an extraordinary thing. I mean, just the affection that Dad had for the others as well. And I think there was a little bit of a disconnect growing up in that atmosphere in which, yeah, we knew that Dad disagreed with these people, but we also knew that he, you know, he would also socialize with them. They had the big, you know, Christmas thing at the court every year. And then, you know, but then in the press, we would see them as, you know, depicted as mortal enemies somehow. But, well, no, it was is much more amicable. And I mean, really, I think a great example of how you can, you know, disagree strongly, but still really get along.
Yeah, if I can add on that for a second, I remember being home once, but probably about 10 years ago or so, visiting home, and my dad was on the phone, and he was having a very, very nice conversation. I didn't know who was on the other end, but it was very clear that somebody he knew pretty well, but hadn't seen in a while. And towards the end of the phone call, he says, "Yeah, I miss you. I miss you." It was very sweet, very tender. Dad hung up, and I said, "Dad, who was that?" He said, "That was David Souter." And so it's not unusual that he really likes David Souter, but you wouldn't guess that if you were just basing it on how many times they were on the same side in a case, or how many times, you know, what their relationship may have been presented as publicly.
That's funny, Chris, because that was exactly the example I was going to use. I remember when Justice Souter retired. I remember your father saying, "I'm going to miss Dave." I think, really?
Yeah.
But you know, he managed to form these friendships. And look, obviously, the justice had a very sharp pen, but I think that he wrote, you know, to warn people against error, to expose what he saw as errors in their writings, the same way he would have wanted them to do to him if he was getting something really wrong. And, you know, obviously we're in a hypersensitive culture now where people take that sharp criticism personally, even mislabel it ad hominem. Like, no, it's not ad hominem to say that your arguments don't make sense. You know, that's an attack on your arguments, not on you as a person. So that was deeply ingrained in him. Yeah, he never, you know, he would respond the same to a bad argument, whoever made it. And again, we see that in Morrison versus Olson with the opinion by Chief Justice Rehnquist.
Professor Otis, do you have anything to add on to that?
Oh, well, so just relatedly, I think one I would get calls occasionally from people who wanted my advice because they were being interviewed by the justice for a clerkship, and I told them, look, I don't really know what's on his mind these days about many things, but here's my one useful piece of advice. You know, if you give him an answer to something and he says, that's ridiculous, do not take that to mean that's ridiculous in the sense of I don't want to hear any more about it. Take that as an invitation to explain why it's not ridiculous. It's meant as a beginning of a conversation, not as a way of ending a conversation. So I think that was, you know, part of what was behind the sharp pen. I mean, yes, he did think the arguments were bad, but it was also designed, you know, if there was something to them, to bring out what the non-ridiculous part of it was, to encourage, you know, in the quest for truth, as opposed to as a way of demeaning anybody.
Okay.
Can I add on to that last point? You know, sometimes it was possible to win an argument with him, and he wouldn't necessarily say, "You're right, I had it all wrong." He would just stop talking and leave the room, and that's when you knew you had won that argument.
My last conversation with him, after all those years of his complaining about the word homily, he says, "Why do they call it a homily? It's a sermon." For some reason, he was just hung up on that. and I moved him on that. I got him to be quiet.
And I will add that Father Scalia's beautiful funeral homily is in the On Faith book as well.
Oh,
Sermon.
that's yes, and
It's a sermon. It's a sermon.
and it is a wonderful example, by the way. It's a very Scalia-esque sermon, I will say, in the sense that his father, you know, it reminded me very much of I mean, his father would have been proud of it, I think, and would have been very pleased with it as well.
Okay, and this next question is from Van Janisek. How did Justice Scalia's faith inform how he approached his job?
Yeah, I think I think we talked about that a little bit already. I mean, as I said, it was never any explicit doctrine. But as I said, I think there are certain habits of thought that he could not help but interiorize as a Catholic that I think informed his approach to doing law and interpreting the Constitution.
And I'll simply add that I guess 2 points. One is that I think there was the ethic of doing the job right that mattered so deeply to him. He says in this one speech we referred to, you know, if your job is to be a hamburger chef, you want to, you know, make a perfect burger. If your job is to be a judge, you know, you want to get the opinions just right. But again, he emphasized that his religious convictions, just like his other strongly held policy views or those views of any other judge, are not to be indulged in deciding what the law is. You're supposed to guard against that. And you know, he's known for you know, trying to make sure that he had a clerk. His counter clerk was a term used, someone who was committed to textualism but who had different policy instincts and preferences. And he wanted this person to be a check on him, to make sure that he wasn't improperly indulging his own views.
Would anyone else like to add on to that? Professor Otis, Chris?
No, those I think that's right.
All right, so one more question. What is the most surprising thing about Scalia you found when writing the books?
Well, I mean, I guess I knew he was gregarious, but just how much he enjoyed being around people, talking to people, traveling the country, traveling the world. Obviously, it helped if there was good hunting nearby. But you know, he just, you know, had a very active, engaged mind, liked to address different topics, loved to meet different people. And you know, one thing that I discovered when we did the Scalia Speaks book, we tried to find out a little something about each speech, the audience to which it was given, how it was set up, that sort of thing. And there's just so many people who just remember as though it were yesterday, you know, when they met him, and just how much time he'd spent with them. Or, you know, in the case of a university president, I recall that they're just amazed how he wanted to talk with classes of students. He didn't just go up there to you know, put in the speech. He actually wanted to spend time with people, to talk about ideas, but also to befriend people. So he really had this wonderful capacity for friendship. Again, it comes through in the eulogies, but also comes through just in the breadth of speeches that he gave to so many different groups.
So I was, I don't know if this was necessary. This really wasn't much of a surprise to me, but I do think it would be a surprise to many people. And just building on a point that I think we touched on earlier, which was that he wrote many opinions and many very powerful and important opinions that kind of defy the stereotype of a Republican appointed justice seeking to promote Republican approved policies. That was a very alliterative sentence, and I promise it was totally ad lib. But so you would have a lot of cases where he would, but Ed mentioned the flag burning case. You know, his friend Walter Burns, who he knew from AEI, published a book very critical of that opinion and saying he didn't mention Dad, who again was his friend, but he was very critical of that opinion. And many conservatives still do not like that opinion. But for Dad, it was, you know, pretty clear that the original public meaning of the freedom of speech protected a symbolic political gesture like that. And there are many others, particularly, and I think this might surprise people more, but his opinions defending the rights of the accused and of defendants. I think people might be, you know, again, we talked about the driving one earlier, but there were more significant ones as well, where, you know, his decision was, you know, the sort of, if it were something that came to the ballot box or something like that, maybe it would have been different. But, you know, his role as a judge was not to apply Republican principles, but to apply the principles that he thought were in those cases, clearly directed in the Constitution itself.
Well, and that's reflected in the stamp that was on his desk, right?
Yes. Yeah.
What is it? Stupid but constitutional.
Yes. Yeah. That he said it during an interview or something like that. He wished he could he had a stamp, and his opinion could just be that stamp. Boom. Stupid but constitutional. And then somebody, a fan of his, sent him that actual stamp. He never used it, though. I should clarify. So that is not in the Essential Scalia.
So, all right. And just to close it out on a lighter note, you have to provide this, okay? There's no dodging this question. What is one fun fact or fun experience that you had with Justice Scalia, or you know about Justice Scalia? No repetitions. So once you take him, it's first come, first serve.
You know, I just liked watching TV late at night with him. He especially you know, when I was home visiting, he would be smoking a cigar, watching classic westerns, and watching those westerns that he knew these, and he would say, "Oh, and he would name the star, tell you what other movies that person was in. And it was fun, and it's true, I didn't really like the movies as much as Dad did, but those are fun experiences. You would reek of cigar smoke afterwards, but it was fun.
Wait, does this have to be humorous or just like a fun fact?
Whatever you want.
Okay. Well, you know, and Chris remembers this as well. We had to do a lot of yard work growing up. And you know, a lot of that was because Dad was behind a desk all day, and like the weekend doing yard work, that was his way of kind of relaxing, but it wasn't our idea of relaxing. And so it was raking leaves in the fall and mowing the lawn in the summer. And we put in a walkway one year, you know, laid the concrete and poured the concrete and put down the flagstones and everything. And of course, I don't think we really valued it at the time, but it was, looking back, it's like, you know, that was kind of great. And there was a sense of accomplishment. You look back, you say, oh gosh, you know, we got something done here today. You know, we got to change things. But the most disturbing thing here, and I'm not sure, maybe I shouldn't say this, but Chris, you probably remember, he would very often, like, we'd be working on something and maybe dinner was approaching or something like that, and he would look at it and go, well, close enough for government work. And that was the end of it. And it wasn't until years later it struck me that he's probably not the guy you want to hear that from. But
if I could just add on to that yard work anecdote, it's true. I do appreciate now why he had us do it, but I also think it's kind of a boy named Sue situation, where although I understand it, still I'm not gonna name my son Sue, and I'm not gonna make my sons do quite as much yard work as I did.
I'm afraid your literary illusions are too highfalutin for this audience.
Well, very briefly, you'd of course expect that every justice would find time sometime during his or her career to speak to the annual convention of the National Wild Turkey Federation. But Justice Scalia managed to do that twice and was also awarded the group's coveted Grand Slam for successfully hunting each of the 4 American subspecies of wild turkey.
Hunting or actually getting one?
I said successfully hunting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you could win an argument with him, but he was fantastically competitive. He was not exactly he was a very intellectually honest person, but he was not a graceful loser at all. He would concede things when necessary. On the competitiveness thing, I guess my anecdote will be that before he was on the Supreme Court, he was, of course, a judge on the Court of Appeals, and Mike Ludig was one of his first law clerks, who later became a judge on the Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. And we used to have our clerk reunions at a Chinese restaurant. He and Mike somehow decided that they were going to get into a competition about who could eat the most peppers.
Hot peppers.
Hot peppers. So the then judge said to Mike, but it's okay. You can have a sip of water if you want. Now the problem with that is that it drives the hot sensation all around your mouth. So this was in fact a way of winning the competition, the important competition of who could eat the most hot peppers.
You said he wasn't a very good loser, but in fairness, he wasn't a very good winner either.
True.
And growing up, we would play cards at the beach, and he would win a hand, and it was, and we're all his like these little kids at the table, and he'd be going, ha 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 ha.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to be ending soon. We have gone over the time limit a lot. Thank you so much to our panelists today, Professor Otis, Father Scalia, Mr. Scalia, and Mr. Whalen. We really appreciate, I know I speak on behalf of David and his team as well as my own, that we really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to spend it with us and to reminisce on the life of Justice Scalia. We will be, both David and I, sending the information about the book plate to our members, so please stay tuned for that email. Again, this concludes our event. Thank you so much to everyone who attended. Have a good evening, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you
all very much.
Thank you for
Pleasure.
having us.